Hey everyone, I hope you're doing well. Today we're going to be looking at how to verify a user's email after they create an account on your site. Now this is episode 3 in the series, and so we're going to be using some of the code from previous episodes. So if things are not making sense, go ahead and just check out those first 2 episodes and everything will be clear. Without further ado, let's get right into it. So we have this page right here where the user can enter their email and then send a verification request. Now, we're going to have this functionality so that they can send another verification request in case they lose the email, but we're also going to have it automatically send a verification request after they register an account on the site. So to show you what we have set up in the database, we have our users table just from last time. We have our one user inside of it, and as you can see, we have this verified field that starts off as a 0. We're going to be writing a program that sets it to a 1. We also have this requests table, which has the user ID, a hash, a timestamp, and a type. Now the hash is what we use to obviously make sure that it's a valid request. The timestamp is used to keep track of when the request is made, and then the type is just going to be a 0 or a 1. 0 is going to be for these verification requests, but we're also going to use this table to do password resets in the future, and that will be what type 1 is. So let's take a look at our HTML here. We just have a basic form with an ID of validate email form, and inside that form is one input with type email and ID email. When you click the submit button, it will call this send validate email request function, which we are going to create using our request function from previous episodes, which will send an AJAX request to a PHP script. Now we also have this CSRF protection that we added in last episode, and we're going to want to add that to this form as well. So to do that, we're going to go to our register.php file, copy the meta tag that has our CSRF token inside of it, and paste it into our new page. And once we've done that, and once we also include utils.php, we are now protected from CSRF attacks. The other important thing to set up beforehand is our email credentials. These are the credentials that allow you to send emails from a PHP script. You can get these credentials from Gmail or from your domain service. Obviously, I'm not going to show you mine, so I just have it commented out, but it's important that you set this before you try to send emails. In addition, we also have the max email verification requests per day, which I set at 3. Now, I have my email credentials set in a separate file called emailcreds.php. Of course, that won't be included in the GitHub because I don't want you to be able to send emails from my account, but just to let you know, I do have them set somewhere. Now I also have this send email request.php file, which is where we're going to write the PHP script that will actually send the email. So let's go ahead and actually just navigate to that PHP script, because we're going to want to see some of the output so that we can kind of work our way through the code here. The first thing we want to do is actually get the email that was sent over as a post variable, and for now we're actually just going to comment that out and hardcode it to be our user's email, which is codebreak05@gmail.com. Of course, this is just for testing. We'll eventually fix this later. So now we can go ahead and actually start connecting to the database. And if you remember, we have a connect function from our utils.php script that we can use to connect to the database and then get some information about the user. Then of course we want to close the connection, and we can set up a little if statement here to see if we actually connected correctly. Otherwise, of course, there's some kind of issue. So now we want to get information about the user. And to do that, we're going to use our SQL select function from the previous episode, which is just going to allow us to run a select query on our database. Now this select query is quite complicated, so we're going to work through it slowly. But I'm just going to set up the basic formula for this function here, and then hop over to table plus in order to kind of work our way through this select script. So we're going to want to select information about our user. And so we're going to create a select query here, and we're going to select the ID, the name, and whether or not that user is verified from our users table. And of course, we have the user's email, so we're going to want to select where the user's email is equal to the email that we passed in as a post variable. But it would also be nice to know if the user sent any verification requests recently, and we can use SQL joins to do that. So if you look at this left join here, it's going to select everything from the left table plus any additional information from the right table. So in this case, the left table is going to be our users table, and the right table is going to be the requests table. So here we go, we're setting up our where our email equals codebreak05. We can run this and see we get our user just fine. And now if we actually use the join statement, I'm going to squeeze that in right before the where clause. We're going to say left join request, and then we're going to say on, and then right here is where we put the condition that we are going to join the tables on, which is going to be the request.id, or sorry, the request.user, whenever that is equal to the users.id. We have to go back here and change this to say users.id because otherwise it is going to be ambiguous. And now when we run that, we get 3 results since there are 3 requests already in our table. Now ideally all the requests would be in one column, so what we're going to do over here is we're actually going to just count the number of requests basically by saying count request.id, and this is going to give us an error. So basically what we need to do here is add in a group by clause to our long select query here. So we just have to add this to the end, and now we should get that there are 3 requests and we can get information about the user as well. Now we want to make sure that we're getting only requests of type 0 and requests that have happened within the last day. So if the requests are super old, we don't really care about them that much. So we're going to add some conditions to our join on statement here. We're going to see if the type is 0 and if the timestamp is greater than a certain value. Of course, when we put this in the PHP, that certain value is going to be the Unix timestamp from 1 day ago, but for now I'm just going to make it 0 for testing. You can see if I change this type, we'll only get 2, and then if I change the timestamp to something invalid, like I'll set this to 0, and we'll just make this a bigger number. You can see when I run that, we also get 2. We're only counting requests that are for validating the email and that have happened within the last day. So we can paste this into our PHP, replace the email and the timestamp with question marks, and fill that information in. So we're going to make a variable called 1 day ago, which will be our timestamp, and then we also want to pass in the email like from before. 1 day ago is just going to be equal to time minus 24 times 60 times 60, which is 1 day in seconds. And with that, we have all the information that you saw before when we were over in Table Plus, so we can just see if the result returned anything. We can make sure that there's 1 row. Otherwise, of course, that means that we could not find a user with that email, or there is some other weird error, so we'll make an else for that. For now, we'll just go ahead and print out the result, and I'll add a little pre-tag up here, so when we look at it on the page, it's nice and white spaced. As you can see, we forgot the $, and now we have our result. We can see that there's 1 row, and then we can now fetch the associated array, and now we have all of that information in our PHP script. So now that we know some stuff about the user, we can make a couple checks here. First, we'll just make a user variable that's going to hold all of that information that we just got. And one thing we can also add is we can free the result once we're done with it to save some memory usage. This is something I didn't do in the last video, so if you want to go ahead and add that to the register.php, it's a good idea to do that. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to check if the user is already verified, because if they're already verified, we don't want to send them an email. So we'll just check if the user verified is 0. That means that they're not yet verified and we can continue on with the normal script. Otherwise, they're already verified. Just going to add in the error statement for if the select statement returns no rows. Now we can go ahead and check how many requests the user has made within the last day, which is just going to be our count requests ID field. So if the number of requests that they have sent within the last day is less than or equal to the max allowed per day, then we're going to proceed with our script as normal. And we're going to actually insert into our requests table, and we're going to send an email to the user. So to do that, we're going to use our SQL insert function that we made in a previous episode, and that's going to return the ID of the row that we inserted. So our statement is going to look like this. We're going to insert into requests, and we're going to enter in null for the ID, and we're going to have, if we look back at our table here, we're going to have the user ID, the hash, and then the type, and the timestamp, sorry. So first we have our user ID. We're also going to have our hash, which we will make in a second. We have our timestamp, and our type is just going to be 0. And we need to fix these parameters. We're going to have a string, and an integer. Actually made a mistake while I was coding this. It should be integer, string, integer. I will fix that in the GitHub, but in the video it's going to stay like this. This is going to give us back our request ID. So if request ID is not -1, it means that we inserted everything just fine. Otherwise, we'll go ahead and print out an error. So if we successfully insert it into our request table, we can now go ahead and actually send them an email. But first we need to actually create our hash. So what is the hash exactly? Well, it's just going to be a set of random bytes. We're going to call this our verify code. We're going to make 16 random bytes here. And that's going to be basically our little passcode that the hash is going to use. So the user, in order to verify their email, they have to know this hash. And the only way they're going to know this hash is because we're going to send it to them in the email. So what we're going to do here is we're going to take our 16 random bytes. We're going to use password hash so that it's not stored in plain text inside of our database. And that's just a little bit overprotective, but we might as well do it because it's so easy in PHP. Basically, this would protect you from users who are somehow in your database. If they can see everything, then they could validate their own email by just looking at the hash in plain text. But if we use password hash, it's going to look like this jarbled text here. So as you can see, after we run the code, we have now inserted into our requests table a new request. So now what we have to do is actually send an email. And to do that, we're going to add a new function to the utilities PHP file. This function is going to take in the address you want to send to, which we'll just call to. It's going to take the name of the user you want to send this to. We'll call that toName, and then the subject and the message of the email. Now to send this email, we could use the PHP mail function, but the PHP mail function is pretty garbage and it has a lot of problems. So we're going to be using something called PHP mailer, which is going to allow us to send SMTP emails from any email that we want as long as we have the credentials, which is why it's important that we put them in earlier. You can read more about why this is better than mail on their GitHub page. Basically, we're going to install it. You can do that either through Composer or do what I did and just download the zip. I then unzip that into the PHP folder, and here it is right here. If we keep scrolling down, it tells us how to include all of the PHP files, so we're just going to add that to the top like I did here. Of course, I changed the path to actually match the path where I have it saved. If we keep going down, they even give us a simple example. So we are going to do what any good coder would do and just copy this entire thing. I'm going to fix the tablature a bit here, and then we can go and walk ourselves through this code. So we don't want to do any debugging, so we can delete that line. And then here we have our host, which is the credentials that we set up before. So this is just going to be SMTP host. And we have SMTP username, password, and finally we have port. Now we also want to change the SMTP secure to be SMTP instead of TLS, which is what it actually recommends over here. So we'll just copy this and paste it in right here. Now here's where we set our recipients and who it was sent from, so we can delete everything except for these two lines. We're going to change our to address to the parameters that we have from the function, and then our from address is going to be our variables that we configured in the config.php. This is the SMTP from and SMTP from name. Alright, we're not sending any attachments, so we can delete that. And then of course here's our subject and here's our message. The alt body is not that important. That's just in case the email could not be interpreted as HTML. We don't need that. And then we'll just return true or false if this sends correctly. I'm going to go ahead and clean up all these comments here because we're not going to need that. And then we can actually test out the email functionality here. So we can just see if send email. So if our email is sent correctly, that means we are all good. Otherwise, of course, we'll output failed to send email. So the email address that we want to send to is, of course, just email. And then the name is going to be the user's name that we got from our select query. And then the subject is something along the lines of email verification. And then finally our message is just going to be a link. Now you can actually put HTML in here and make this look all nice, but for now I'm just going to put a little link in here that says click this link to verify your email, and we will just link this to our page. This link is actually going to take us to our form that we saw before, and I'll show you how we're going to set that up. So in the htaccess file, I have this code set up so that we can actually make our link a little bit prettier, where we just say validate, and then we pass in the request ID and then the hash, and that will actually get interpreted as get variables inside of that PHP script. And so we want to send verify code here, but we're going to use our URL safe encode function so that it is safe to put in the URL. And as you can see, it worked. And you can see I now have an email from Codebreak, so we can just open this, click the link, and it will take us to our form. Now if we take a look at the URL, you can see we have the request ID and the verify code inside of the URL as get variables, which we can now look at. So what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and set this whole thing up so that if the get variables exist, we're going to display something else. Otherwise, we'll just display our regular form. So if ID and hash are set and they're not equal to empty strings, we're going to want to see if this is a valid request and verify the user if it is. So otherwise, of course, we just want to display our regular form. So I'm going to copy this and paste this into our else statement. This is a little weird here. You can actually close the PHP script just to kind of put HTML inside of your if statement. You could also put this all into an echo. That works just the same, but I think this is a little bit more elegant. So if we take the get variables out of our URL, we can see our form, but otherwise we can't see the form. So now if we have those get variables, we'll connect to our database and we will get our request. So if the connection was successful, we're doing the same thing as before, checking for errors here, which of course later we will replace with nice messages for the user. And actually we can do that now. We'll just put a little header on the screen for the user to see, something like failed to connect to database for this error. And now what we can do is use our SQL select function to select the proper request from the request table. So we're just going to select all from the request table where ID is equal to our ID get variable. So we don't actually need to select everything, so we will change that in a second, but first I want to also just make sure that the type is always 0. Shouldn't be an issue, but we'll just say and type is equal to 0. Now if we look back at our database, you can see we also have a hash and a timestamp, so we're going to want to get that information as well. Now we're going to do the same as before and set up a little if statement. So if we get a result here and if the number of rows is 1, then that means we successfully selected all the data we need from the database. Otherwise there's an error, and we'll print that out nicely to the user. So now what we can do is we can actually go ahead and fetch our associated array here and check the timestamp and the hash of the request. Again, we're freeing the results just to save as much memory as we can. And the first thing we're going to do is check the timestamp. We're going to have a little policy here where all the verification requests will expire after a day. So we'll just check if timestamp is greater than time minus 60 times 60 times 24. So if the timestamp is greater than that value, it means that this request was sent within the last 24 hours. So we can go ahead and now check the hash. I'm also going to add a little link here so you can go to the verification request form if the request has expired and send yourself a new email. So I mistakenly changed this to less than right here. I don't know why I second guessed myself, but we'll come back to fix that later. Now we need to check the hash. So to do that, we're going to use password verify. This is also a built-in PHP function, and we can actually just put this whole thing in an if statement since it returns a boolean, and we'll do that in a second. The first parameter is going to be the hash from our get variable, which of course we need to decode first. And then the other parameter is the hash that's stored in the database. Wrap this whole thing in an if statement, and if that was true, that means that the hash is valid and we can now validate the user. So if everything went according to plan, we can just print out that your email was verified. So we can go ahead and refresh here, and we can see that our email verification request was expired because I flipped the greater than to a less than right here, which was a mistake. So if we fix that and refresh, we now see email verified. Of course, we didn't actually verify the email because we didn't update the user's database, or sorry, the user's table. So we're going to go ahead and do that right now. So we're going to want to first make an SQL update function. Now these are just helper functions, and I don't claim that these are a great way to send these requests, but it kind of makes my code shorter, which I appreciate. So I'm just going to throw this in here. It's pretty much exactly the same as the SQL insert, except instead of returning an insert ID, it's just going to return true or false. Now I know this is a lot of duplicate code, but please don't stress too much about it. We're not really focused about code organization in this series, it's mostly about functionality. So now we can use the SQL update function to verify our user. And of course this is going to return a boolean, so we can put all this in an if-else statement. So we're going to pass in our connection, and we're also going to pass in our statement here, which is going to be update users set verified equal to true, where ID is equal to our user's ID. And that user's ID is of course coming from the database, which is our request user field. As you can see, we have actually verified our user. So now what we want to do is actually just delete all of the verification requests once we successfully verify the user. To do that, we could create an SQL delete function, but it's going to look exactly the same as SQL update, so that kind of seems pointless. So don't panic here, but I'm going to use SQL update to make a delete query. I know it's a little weird and definitely horrible organization, but it works, so we're doing it. So we're going to delete all the requests where the user is equal to the user from the request query that we made before, and of course only type equals 0. So we're going to delete all of the type 0 requests for this user. We don't really care if it fails because it's not the end of the world if it does. We have a little error here that we need to go back and fix real quick. Accidentally added an S there. We have one more error, of course, because I forgot the from in our delete statement. Now you can see that our email is verified. If we go look at our table, all of the requests have been deleted. Perfect. I'm going to quickly add some style to our messages so that they're nice and big and in the center of our screen. And this shouldn't take too long, and it's not really important that I show you exactly what I'm doing. I'm just wrapping everything in a div and adding some CSS to it. So now if we take a look at that, we can see we have a nice, easy to read message in the center of our screen. So all we have to do now is put this into our JavaScript so that when you click the submit button, it will actually send the validation request. And we're also, of course, going to set it up so that once a user registers, it will send the validation request too. So first we're going to go over to our JavaScript and create our send validation email request function, which is just going to call request. It's going to point to our PHP script. We're going to pass in validate email form as our form. And then our function here, we're going to have error codes that we set up. So we can actually just kind of steal the code from the previous episode where we have this switch statement here. We also want all of the code that deals with the CSS for the errors, so I'll take that as well. So because of the way that this works, the numbers for error codes are actually coming as strings, so we just have to make sure we set those as strings. And then of course I'm going to change all of these error codes so that they match the actual error that occurs here. So 0 is a success error code, or it's not really an error code. 0 means success, so we're going to print out that the email was sent. Otherwise, we're going to go through here and just set all of these errors to match the error code. So I'm going to kind of go through and replace these human readable errors with numbers, and then just make a nice little error message for the user on the JavaScript side. I'm also going to delete our little test code that we had at the top so that we are now taking an email from a post variable. Now I'm going to speed through this because it's just a little tedious and you guys already know what all the errors are and what the error messages are going to kind of look like. So I'm just going to zoom through this. We also want to make sure that we're making our switch statement on data, not data at index I, so I'll just fix that. And now if we go ahead and go over to our page and send in an email verification request, you can see the email has been sent. I can now check my email and we can look at our request here. It's been added to the table. I can click on this link and go and verify my email just like that. Now, as you can see, all the requests are deleted. Our user is now verified, and this request is now invalidated. We can go back now to our register page and add the functionality to that register functionality. So what we're going to do is we're going to wrap this whole thing inside of a function called send validation request. And that way we can call this function from our register.php code. This is just going to take in the email. We can now tab all this out, replace all of the echoes with returns, and then we have a good function here. So one issue is now when we send that AJAX request to this file, it's not going to run the code right away. So what we'll do is we'll set up a little isSet down here. So if there is a post variable called email, we'll actually call the function. Now our register.php script also takes in a post variable called email, so this will also call the function automatically. And the way to fix this is just to rename this to something other than email. So we'll just change this to validate email. Don't forget the label. So we can see if validate email is set, we'll run this function automatically. And now we can go over to our register.php script and just, if everything works successfully, we can go ahead and call the send validation email function. Now, like I said before, we want to replace all of these echoes with returns. So if there's no error here, or if there is some weird error, we'll return -1. Of course, we want to also echo out whatever is returned from our send validation email function. Now we can go over to our register.php script again and call this function on the user's email. And we'll check if or we'll actually save the error so that we can send back an error code. Now, if the error is equal to 0, that means the email was sent properly, and we'll just return 0 as our error code. Otherwise, we're going to send back a different error code. If you look at our register.php script, the error codes go all the way up to 9, and these error codes go up to 6. So what we can do is we can just add 9 to the value that's returned by this function, and we now have unique error codes. So now we can go into our JavaScript and just add all these error codes to our register function, which is also pretty tedious and boring, so I'm going to speed through it. I'm just copying this in here and changing all of the numbers accordingly. So just to run a little test for you guys, let's delete our current user, make sure all the requests are deleted, and go ahead and go to our register form. You can go ahead and fill this out really easily. And once we create our user, of course, we're going to get an error because nothing works first try. And that error is simply because we forgot to include our send validation email.php file inside of the register.php file. And this file actually includes utils, so we can just take that out. Now if we delete our user and try this again, you can see we've created a new account, and we also have an email that we can use to validate the user. Alright, so thank you guys for watching. This is how to validate an email using PHP. If you guys enjoyed, please like the video and leave comments if you have any suggestions for future videos. Next topic we're going to be tackling is actually logging into this system, so stay tuned for that. Thank you guys for watching. Bye.